Now, Donald Trump appeared to be euphoric during the question and answer session following those talks. Does he really have cause for such optimism?
Well, I don't think so. I think one has to agree with what many of the senators and others were saying back in the United States. He's given up an awful lot, it would seem, in just meeting with Kim, and has received nothing back in return of any significance. You know, that one-page document contains just one sentence in which Kim says he's committing North Korea to moving towards denuclearization, but everything is in that word "towards." What does it mean? It's a sort of weasel word that can be used in many different ways to get out of actually doing anything. The problem is, you know, that this doesn't really seem to be very much more than anything that has been given before by the North Koreans. Any promises that they've made before, in some respects, even less than the promises they made back in 1994 and 2005. But perhaps, you know, Marco Rubio is right, the former Republican candidate, when he says that we really have to wait and see. We have to judge a year down the road to see whether there's going to be more substance to this. But at the moment, it would seem, just on what we've seen so far, that there is very little there. There's none of the complete, verifiable, irreversible that we were led to expect from the Americans when we heard Mark Pompeo, the Secretary of State, talking before the summit. And, you know, one has to ask a question, you know, if this had been Barack Obama negotiating this deal, and this is what he'd come back to Washington with, what would the Republicans be saying now? What would Donald Trump be saying now? And I suggest that he would be tearing it to pieces.
OK, well, if we consider this as a first step in what might be a longer relationship, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo arrives in Seoul today for talks with his South Korean counterpart and Japanese counterpart, I believe, as well. Yeah. Do you think we'll see more concrete, binding outcomes from that meeting? Well,
one certainly has to hope so. You know, at the summit, or just after the summit at the press conference, Donald Trump said that, you know, the really serious work gets going now. We didn't really have enough time today, he said, to get into the real detail. But the detail will be addressed by a U.S. team who will be led by Mike Pompeo. And it has to be said, Pompeo is certainly no pushover. So I imagine he will be demanding on those key issues of denuclearization being complete, verifiable, and irreversible. He'll press the North Koreans on that. And if there isn't progress, one would imagine that at some point down the line, the Americans will step back and say, look, this isn't the deal we were looking for. Perhaps we need to readdress it. But at the same time, Pompeo is going to have to do some pretty urgent reassuring to his South Korean host, because at that same press conference, Donald Trump came out with this announcement that the United States was going to stop the joint military exercises with the South Koreans. It's not clear at all that the South Koreans knew that was about to come up, which will make them worried. First of all, because they think those exercises are important, and secondly, because he seems capable of making decisions like that without consulting them.
Indeed, we will be following those talks today. Thank you very much, Rob Parsons.